An FBI agent's undercover mission exposes a corrupt cop's deadly secret, justice or chaos. The shocking truth unfolds. Officer Bryce Warren sat in his patrol car, the low rumble of the engine vibrating through the silence of the night. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel impatiently, the weight of boredom heavy on his shoulders. It was another quiet night patrolling the forgotten neighborhoods of Riverwood Heights, a part of the city he had long dismissed as hopeless. To him, this place was a breeding ground for trouble, dilapidated homes, flickering streetlights, and people he believed didn't care enough to change their circumstances. He sighed, glancing at the clock. 3 more hours of this. His jaw tightened as he drove past boarded-up shops and empty streets, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. But just as he turned the corner near an old gas station, his eyes caught something, or someone. A young black woman stood alone outside a convenience store, holding a grocery bag in one hand and shifting her weight awkwardly from one leg to the other. She wore an oversized hoodie, its hood pulled low over her head, and jeans that were ripped at the knees. Something about her presence felt off to Bryce. Too young to be out here at this hour. Too suspicious to be standing around aimlessly. His instincts, honed from years of patrolling neighborhoods like this, kicked in. Trouble, he thought to himself. She didn't need to be doing anything specific to catch his suspicion. Just being here was enough. Bryce pulled his patrol car to the curb, cutting the engine but leaving the red and blue lights flashing. He watched her for a moment, her movements slow, deliberate, unhurried. She didn't seem startled or in a rush to leave. That irritated him. He reached for his flashlight and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel with an authoritative thud. The woman turned slightly at the sound, her face partially obscured by the hoodie. She didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't panic. Bryce's irritation grew. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp and cutting through the stillness of the night. "What are you doing here?" The woman turned fully toward him now. Her face was young, probably no older than her mid-20s, with deep brown eyes that stared at him without fear. "Just waiting for my ride," she said, her voice calm but firm. Bryce's eyebrows arched, his flashlight sweeping over her grocery bag. "At this hour? Don't you think it's a little late to be hanging around here? Got ID on you?" She tilted her head slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Why do I need ID to stand on a sidewalk?" Bryce's grip on the flashlight tightened. He hated this, when they pushed back, acted like they didn't know him answers. "Because I said so. Show me what's in the bag," he barked, his tone more commanding now. The young woman sighed, setting the bag down and pulling it open. Inside were mundane items, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a few apples. Nothing remotely suspicious. She picked up the bag again, her movements deliberate, her calm demeanor unwavering. "That's all?" Bryce asked, his voice laced with disbelief. He stepped closer, towering over her. "What are you really doing here? You selling something? Meeting someone?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her tone remained steady. "Officer, I'm just waiting for my ride. I don't have to explain myself to you." Bryce's pulse quickened. He wasn't used to this, a young woman standing her ground. Most people would have stumbled over their words, offered excuses, or begged to be let go. But not her. The lack of fear in her voice unsettled him. It felt like a challenge, and Bryce hated challenges. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, stepping even closer, his flashlight now inches from her face. "This is my street. You don't just stand around like you own the place." Her calm gaze locked onto his, and she spoke slowly. "I don't own the street, officer, but neither do you." For a moment, Bryce's breath caught. The words hit him like a punch, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because of their quiet, unwavering truth. His fists clenched as he struggled to regain control of the situation. He needed to make her feel small, remind her who held the authority. "Don't move," he growled, reaching for his radio. "We'll see how long you keep that attitude once I run your name." As Bryce radioed for backup, the young woman remained still, her posture straight, her gaze unyielding. The air between them crackled with tension. Bryce thought he had control of the situation, but the look in her eyes suggested otherwise. Something told him this encounter wasn't going to end the way he expected. Here's the rewritten version of the story, incorporating your requested changes. Officer Bryce Warren clenched his jaw as he stood inches away from Maya Bennett, a young black woman who remained unervingly calm under his glare. The warm summer night had fallen deathly quiet around them, the distant hum of the city fading into the background. Bryce's grip on his flashlight tightened, the beam of light hovering over Maya's face. She didn't flinch. That calm, unwavering confidence only stoked the fire of his frustration. "I asked for your ID," Bryce repeated, his voice low but sharp, each word punctuated with irritation. Maya, standing in her oversized hoodie and worn sneakers, tilted her head slightly. "I've already told you, officer. I'm just waiting for my ride. I haven't done anything wrong." Her voice was even, steady, as if she wasn't rattled in the slightest. Bryce snatched the worn wallet from her outstretched hand, scanning the ID. Maya Bennett, a local address in a nearby apartment complex. Nothing suspicious on paper, but Bryce wasn't satisfied. He handed the ID back with a flick of his wrist, his jaw tightening as he leaned in closer. "Why are you really out here, Maya?" he growled, the suspicion in his voice thick. "You're not fooling me. What are you up to?" Maya met his eyes, her gaze unflinching. "I already told you, officer. Just groceries and waiting for my ride. There's no need to treat me like a criminal." Her calm tone cut through Bryce like a blade. How dare she act as though his badge, his authority, didn't command respect? His chest tightened, anger boiling just below the surface. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the pavement. "Listen here," Bryce snapped, his face now only inches from hers. "You don't tell me what I need to do. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." The tension between them grew thick, heavy as the air around them seemed to still. Bryce's pulse raced as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He had dealt with dozens of people like her before, or so he thought. But Maya was different. She didn't cower, didn't stumble over her words, didn't flinch under his gaze. That unnerved him. Maya sighed softly, the kind of sigh that wasn't fear or submission, but exhaustion. "Officer," she said, her tone calm yet firm, "I don't think standing outside with a bag of groceries makes me a threat. Maybe you should rethink how you see people in this neighborhood." Bryce's breath hitched, her words hitting a nerve he didn't want to acknowledge. "You don't know me, and you don't get to lecture me," he barked, his voice rising. "You're just another." He stopped himself, his teeth clenching as he caught the words before they spilled out. He stepped back, trying to regain his composure, but his frustration only grew as Maya stood silently, unshaken. "I know these streets better than you do," Maya said, her tone soft yet unyielding. "I've lived here my whole life. You don't need to tell me how to stay safe." Bryce scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Safe? You think you're safe standing here? You don't know what happens in this part of town, do you?" Maya's gaze never wavered. "I know plenty, officer," she replied. "But what I'm doing right now, standing here, minding my business, isn't a crime." Her steady defiance sent a wave of anger rippling through Bryce. He could feel the situation slipping from his grasp, her composure like a mirror reflecting his own insecurities back at him. His breathing quickened as he clenched his fists, his authority being tested in a way he wasn't used to. "Let me tell you something," Bryce said, his voice low and venomous. He leaned in closer, so close their shoes nearly touched. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to stand here and act like you're above the rules. Do you understand me?" Maya's expression didn't change. She tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed together in a thoughtful line. "I'm not above the rules," she said softly, "but I'm also not breaking any. I just don't scare as easily as you seem to think." Her words landed like a slap, knocking the air from Bryce's lungs. He stepped back, his chest heaving as his mind scrambled for a way to reassert control. But for the first time in his career, he didn't know how to win. The quiet strength in Maya's eyes spoke louder than any argument, any badge, any uniform. The street around them remained eerily silent, the air thick with unspoken tension. Bryce's flashlight trembled slightly in his grip, his mind racing. He needed to regain control. Somehow, some way. before it slipped completely through his fingers. Here's the rewritten part of the story based on your request, featuring the themes of racism and abuse of power, with the main female character as a young black woman, enhanced with suspense and conflict. Officer Bryce Warren's vision blurred with rage, his teeth grinding as he struggled to keep his composure. The young woman standing before him, Maya Bennett, refused to cower under the weight of his authority. Her calmness was unbearable, a silent defiance that made his chest tighten with frustration. It wasn't just her words that infuriated him. It was the way she stood there, her head held high as though his uniform, his badge, his power meant nothing. "You should be afraid," he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper. His hand twitched near his belt, where his flashlight hung like a silent warning. "You don't know who you're messing with." Maya's eyes flicked down briefly, noting the subtle movement of his hand, before returning to his gaze. She didn't back away, didn't blink. "No, officer," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "You don't know who you're talking to." The words sent a jolt through Bryce's chest, a strange unease twisting in his gut. How did she say it with such certainty? How did she hold her ground without so much as a flicker of fear? The realization hit him like a slap. She wasn't scared of him, not even a little. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Bryce spat, the venom in his words barely concealed. "You think you can just stand here and talk to me like that, like you're better than me?" "I never said that," Maya replied, her voice calm, her words like a steady current eroding his control. "I told you the truth. I'm just trying to get home." Bryce's face flushed red, and he stepped closer, closing the distance until there was barely an inch of space between them. "You're lying," he growled, his voice dropping into a near snarl. "I know you are. I can see it in your eyes." Maya's steady gaze didn't waver. "And what do you see in my eyes, Officer Warren?" she asked, her tone calm, unflinching. Bryce opened his mouth to respond but found no words. For the first time, he hesitated. What did he see? He couldn't answer because he didn't know. All he knew was that her lack of fear, her refusal to submit, was throwing him off balance in a way he couldn't explain. It made him feel small, powerless, as though his badge and uniform had been stripped of meaning. "Listen," he said, his voice trembling slightly now, betraying the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You don't get to walk away from this, not after disrespecting me like that. You're going to learn your place, and I'm going to make sure of it." Maya remained silent, her eyes locked on his, watching him carefully. She wasn't challenging him, not overtly, but her calmness was a challenge in itself. Her refusal to react, to flinch, was infuriating. Bryce's pulse raced, his mind grasping for a way to regain control of the situation, but her silence was suffocating, a weight pressing down on him. "Why are you doing this?" Bryce demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "Why are you acting like you're untouchable? You're not. I could arrest you right now, and no one would care." "You could," Maya replied quietly. "But would that make you feel better, Officer Warren?" The question hit Bryce like a hammer, knocking the wind out of him. His fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white as he tried to suppress the urge to lash out. How could she remain so calm? How could she look him in the eye, stand there in the face of his growing rage, and still ask him that? "You don't get to walk away," he said again, his voice shaking. "I'm going to make sure of that." But even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. For the first time in his career, Bryce didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he had control over the situation. And for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Doubt about himself, about his motives, about his authority. That doubt was more terrifying than anything else. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating, the weight of their confrontation pressing down on Bryce's chest like a stone. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body tensed and ready for something. But Maya didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her unwavering calmness throwing him completely off balance. And in that moment, Bryce Warren felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not of Maya, but of himself. Bryce Warren's grip tightened on Maya Bennett's arm, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. The groceries in her hand trembled, but she held on to them, her balance shifting slightly as she tried to steady herself. Her calm expression, unwavering even now, was a quiet rebellion that made Bryce's blood boil. "You think you can just stand here and talk to me like that?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. His voice dripped with venom, low and menacing, as if daring her to defy him further. "You think I'm going to let you walk away after disrespecting me?" Maya's eyes dropped briefly to where his hand gripped her arm, then slowly rose to meet his gaze. Her calm and steady look cut through the tension like a blade. She didn't cry out, didn't plead, didn't even flinch. Instead, her voice came soft but firm, cutting through his anger. "Let go of me." Her words weren't a plea, they were a command. Bryce's grip tightened further, his knuckles turning white. Something in the back of his mind told him to stop, to pull back before this went too far. But that whisper of reason was drowned out by the roar of frustration swelling inside him. How could she still be so composed? How could she stand there, defiant, as though his authority meant nothing? "No," he spat, jerking her closer. His voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You're the one out here, acting like you own this place." "Well, guess what? You don't." "I do." Maya blinked, tilting her head slightly. Her expression remained calm, but her voice carried an edge of quiet strength. "Is this really about me, Officer Warren? Or is this about you?" Her words hit him harder than a slap. Bryce's face flushed with anger, his jaw clenching as his heart pounded in his ears. How dare she? How dare this young woman stand there and question him, challenge him, as if she had any right to psychoanalyze him, as if she knew anything about him or the pressures he faced. "Shut up," he growled, his voice cracking under the weight of his fury. "You don't know anything about me." Her silence in response was deafening. It was as though she didn't need to say another word, as if her unflinching gaze alone was enough to call out every insecurity he tried to bury. She wasn't afraid of him, not his badge, not his threats, and that terrified him in a way he couldn't explain. "I'm not going to ask you again," Bryce said, his voice louder now, trembling with uncertainty. "You either cooperate, or this is going to get a lot worse for you." Maya didn't move. She didn't pull away, didn't struggle. She simply stood there, staring into his eyes with a calm so unnerving it made his stomach twist. "You already lost control," she said quietly, her voice steady and deliberate. "The moment you laid a hand on me." Her words landed like a hammer, cracking the fragile armor of his ego. Bryce's mind raced, trying to process what she just said, but his body reacted first. His free hand shot up in a flash of impulsive rage, connecting with her face in a sharp, sickening blow. The force of it sent Maya stumbling back, her grocery bag falling to the ground as cans and produce scattered across the pavement. She caught herself on one knee, her hand braced against the cracked concrete. Bryce froze, his fist still clenched, his breath harsh and uneven. The sound of the punch echoed in his head, louder than the empty street around them. He stared at her, paralyzed by what he'd just done. Maya wiped a small trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet, her movements deliberate and composed. She didn't cry, didn't yell. She didn't even look afraid. When she turned to face him again, her eyes locked onto his, and this time they weren't just calm, they were piercing. "You're going to regret that," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. Bryce felt a chill run down his spine, the icy tendrils of dread creeping over him. He tried to respond, to say something, but his throat felt tight, his tongue heavy. Maya reached into her pocket with slow, deliberate movements, and his instincts kicked in. His hand went to his belt, hovering near his gun. "Don't," he barked, his voice tinged with panic. "Don't even think about it." But it wasn't a weapon she pulled from her pocket. It was something much worse. She held up a small black leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. The gold and silver reflected the dim glow of the streetlight above. Bryce's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the badge in disbelief. "I'm Special Agent Maya Bennett," she said, her tone calm and cold. "And you, Officer Warren, just made the biggest mistake of your career. Bryce Warren stood frozen, staring at the FBI badge in Maya Bennett's hand as though it were a weapon aimed directly at his chest. The world tilted around him, and a nauseating wave of panic surged through his system. His hand dropped from his belt, hanging limp at his side as his mind scrambled for any way, to undo the damage. But there was no undoing it. The reality was stark and inescapable. He had struck an undercover federal agent. The sirens grew louder, their piercing wail bouncing off the dark buildings around them. But Bryce could barely hear them over the thunderous pounding of his heartbeat. He stared at Maya, no longer the defenseless young woman he thought she was, but an FBI agent who now held his fate in her hands. Maya stood her ground, her posture relaxed yet unyielding. The slight bruise on her cheek was still visible, a painful reminder of the blow he had delivered just moments earlier. Yet her expression was unreadable. Not angry, not gloating, but coldly professional. It unsettled Bryce more than if she had yelled or threatened him. She was waiting, and he could feel the weight of what was coming crashing down on him. "You don't understand," Bryce muttered, his voice hoarse, shaky. "This wasn't supposed to happen. You don't." Maya cut him off with quiet precision, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "You made it happen, Officer Warren. You made choices." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Bryce's jaw clenched and his mind raced. The sirens, once a source of reassurance, now filled him with dread. His knees wobbled as if they might buckle beneath him. "I didn't," Bryce began, his voice cracking. He searched for words, an excuse, something to explain away what had happened. "I didn't know who you were. You were undercover, you. I'm an FBI agent, and you assaulted me," Maya said flatly, cutting through his words with brutal efficiency. "That's all that matters now." Bryce's breath caught in his throat, and his hands trembled at his sides. Everything felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. This was his street, his beat, his rules, until now. Somehow, in the blink of an eye, everything had flipped, and he was no longer in control. Maya stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but its sharpness pierced him all the same. "You think you're above the law, don't you, Officer Warren? You've been doing this for a long time, haven't you? Picking on the people you think can't fight back." Bryce's throat tightened, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but it was drowned out by the suffocating weight of her words. She could see him, truly see him, in a way that no one else ever had. And she was right. "I was just," Bryce began, but the words faltered. "Just what? Just doing his job? Just enforcing the law?" The excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears. Maya's voice broke through again, calm yet heavy with the truth. "You didn't mean to get caught. You didn't think anyone would ever hold you accountable. But here we are, Officer Warren. You were wrong." Bryce's pulse raced. His head spun. He'd always heard rumors of federal investigations, of probes into his precinct, but they were always dismissed as gossip. No one thought it would ever touch them, least of all him. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a cop doing what needed to be done. At least, that's what he'd always told himself. "You don't understand," Bryce whispered again, his voice barely audible. He felt like he was drowning. Maya took another step forward, her voice sharper now, her tone carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "I understand perfectly, Officer Warren. You've been hiding behind that badge for years, abusing your power because you thought no one would stop you. But the badge doesn't make you untouchable. It doesn't put you above the people you're supposed to serve." Bryce's fists clenched, but not in defiance. It was the only way he could steady himself as her words struck him with the force of a sledgehammer. Maya's voice softened, almost to a whisper. "You didn't lose control just tonight. You lost control a long time ago." The sirens were deafening now, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing lights illuminated the dark street in bursts of red and blue. Bryce felt the cold sweat break out across his forehead as the vehicles screeched to a halt nearby. Maya glanced toward the approaching cars, then back at him, her voice calm but damning. "Backup is here. You're finished." Bryce felt the air leave his lungs. He was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to think. The weight of his actions crushed him as the agents spilled out of the vehicles, their determined steps echoing in the quiet night. And in that moment, Bryce Warren knew there was no escape. Officer Bryce Warren felt the world tilt as he stood immobilized, the faint red and blue flickers of approaching sirens reflecting off the damp pavement. Maya Carter, her cheek still swelling from his blow, stood a mere step away. She was no longer the young, defenseless woman he thought she was. The weight of her FBI badge gleamed in her hand, burning an indelible truth into his brain. His career, his authority, everything he thought made him untouchable, was gone. Bryce muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "This wasn't supposed to happen. You don't understand." Maya's expression didn't waver. Her voice was cold, unrelenting. "You made this happen, Officer Warren. Every step of it." Bryce's pulse roared in his ears as the flashing lights swelled brighter, their beams slicing through the narrow alley. His hands shook at his sides, his mind desperately grasping for a way to undo what he had done. But there was no undoing this. No apology, no excuse, no badge to hide behind. He had crossed the line in a way that could never be erased. Tires screeched as a black SUV and two squad cars came to an abrupt halt. Men in suits, their faces carved in stone, stepped out of the vehicles, followed by uniformed officers. Bryce's breath hitched as he recognized the lead agent, a tall, imposing man with eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. The agent approached Maya and nodded, his tone respectful yet brisk. "Agent Carter, are you all right?" Maya didn't break eye contact with Bryce. Her words were steady but brimming with unshakable resolve. "I'm fine. He gave us more than enough evidence." Bryce's stomach twisted. More than enough evidence? He scanned Maya's coat, his eyes catching on a small, almost invisible black button near her collar. A camera. The realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. She had been recording the entire time. Every word, every threat, every second of his violence was documented. The walls of his career closed in around him. You set me up," Bryce whispered, his voice barely audible. Maya stepped closer, her tone unwavering. "Set you up? No, Officer Warren. I didn't need to. You set yourself up the moment you decided to abuse your power. All I did was shine a light on it." The words were a dagger straight to his core. Bryce could feel the weight of her gaze, a calm, measured judgment that stripped him of every pretense he'd used to justify his actions. His hands trembled uncontrollably, the world around him seeming to spin. He had thought himself invincible, his badge a shield. Now, standing cuffed before a federal agent, he realized how fragile his authority truly was. One of the agents moved behind him, snapping cold steel cuffs around his wrists. Bryce didn't resist. He couldn't. The handcuffs bit into his skin, and he was struck by the cruel irony. He had cuffed countless people over the years, convinced of his moral authority, and now here he was on the other side. As they led him toward the waiting car, Bryce stole a glance back at Maya. She stood motionless, her expression calm and unreadable, her badge still in her hand. She watched him with the kind of composed finality that only someone holding absolute power could wield. He had made himself a symbol of unchecked authority. Now, she was tearing that symbol down brick by brick. Before they shoved him into the back seat, her voice pierced the air once more, barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a courtroom gavel. "This isn't just about you, Officer Warren. It's about your entire department, your entire system. We're going to dismantle it, piece by piece." Bryce's heart plummeted as the door slammed shut behind him, silencing the world outside. He had thought the nightmare couldn't get worse. But as the car pulled away and the sound of sirens faded into the distance, he realized the nightmare had only just begun. Maya stood alone in the quiet street, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows around her. This moment, she knew, wasn't just an end for Bryce Warren. It was the start of a reckoning for a system built on silence, fear, and abuse. And this was just the beginning. Bryce Warren sat in the back of the squad car, the sharp metal of the handcuffs digging into his wrists, a cruel reminder of how drastically his world had changed. The once familiar streets of Chicago blurred past the window, streaks of light and shadow flickering across his face. These streets had always been his domain, where his badge made him king. Now, they felt foreign, hostile even, as though the city itself was rejecting him. Bryce clenched his jaw, replaying the past hour in his mind like a haunting reel he couldn't shut off. The confrontation, the punch, the badge. He still couldn't wrap his head around it. Maya Carter, the defiant young black woman he had dismissed as insignificant, had turned out to be an undercover FBI agent. And he had hit her. On camera. The weight of his actions was suffocating, an iron grip tightening around his chest. His career, his reputation, everything he had built with an iron fist was unraveling, thread by thread. The car jolted as it hit a pothole, snapping Bryce back to reality. His heart sank as the precinct came into view, its stark facade bathed in the eerie glow of red and blue lights. The parking lot was unusually quiet, the silence only amplifying his dread. This was where his badge had given him power, where he had commanded respect, fear even. Now, he wasn't walking in as an officer. He was walking in as a criminal. The rear door swung open, and a young officer, someone Bryce didn't recognize, gestured for him to step out. Bryce hesitated, his legs feeling like lead, but the officer's firm grip on his arm left no room for defiance. As soon as his feet hit the pavement, the reality of his situation slammed into him like a freight train. The handcuffs clinked with every step, their cold bite a stark contrast to the heat rising in his chest. Inside, the precinct buzzed with a stunned energy. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and a ripple of whispers followed Bryce as he was led through the front area. Familiar faces stared in disbelief. Officers he had worked with for years, shared beers with, and lorded over. "Is that Warren?" one voice muttered, hushed but audible enough to sting. "What the hell did he do?" another whispered. Bryce kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the floor. He couldn't bear to meet their eyes, to see the shock and betrayal etched on their faces. Each step felt like a walk to the gallows, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. At the processing desk, he was shoved into a chair across from an older officer with a clipboard and an expression devoid of sympathy. The man stared at Bryce for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile the once dominant officer with the prisoner in front of him. "Name?" the officer asked, his tone flat, professional. Bryce swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Bryce Warren," he muttered, barely audible. The officer scribbled on his clipboard. "Charges are pending, but assaulting a federal agent is the big one." Bryce's throat tightened, the words hitting him like a sledgehammer. He wanted to protest, to explain, but what could he say? He had hit an FBI agent. On camera. There was no one doing that. "You'll be held in the cells until federal custody takes over," the officer continued, barely glancing up. "For now, consider yourself our guest." The word guest twisted the knife in Bryce's gut. He wasn't a guest. He was a prisoner. And for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of what that truly meant. After being fingerprinted and photographed, Bryce was led down a dimly lit hallway toward the holding cells. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and disinfectant, a nauseating mix that turned his stomach. He had walked this hallway countless times before, always with authority, always in control. Now, it felt suffocating, the walls pressing in with every step. The officer unlocked a cell and gestured for Bryce to step inside. He hesitated, his legs trembling, but the sharp nudge from the officer behind him left no room for resistance. The door clanged shut, the sound echoing through the empty block, final and absolute. Bryce sat heavily on the cold metal bench, his head in his hands. The reality of his actions, the consequences looming ahead, weighed on him like 1,000 stones. He had once believed his badge made him untouchable. Now, stripped of it, he felt small, vulnerable. For the first time in years, Bryce Warren didn't feel like a man in control. He felt like a man who had lost everything. Bryce Warren flinched as the heavy metal door of the holding cell clanged open, the sound reverberating through the stark hallway like a gunshot. The officer behind him shoved him forward with no ceremony, and Bryce stumbled into the tiny cell. The door slammed shut behind him, the lock clicking into place with a chilling finality. For the first time in his life, Bryce found himself on the wrong side of the bars. The cell was suffocating, barely larger than a closet. A narrow cot, its mattress thin and stained, was pushed against the far wall. A rusted sink clung to the corner, paired with a toilet that offered no privacy. The walls, scratched with graffiti, felt like they were closing in on him. Bryce stood frozen, his breath shallow as the reality of his situation sank in. He wasn't an officer here. He wasn't in control. He was a prisoner. He sank onto the cot, his head in his hands. The cold steel of the handcuffs still burned against his wrists, a cruel reminder of his downfall. His thoughts raced, bouncing between disbelief, anger, and a gnawing regret that he couldn't shake. He wanted to blame someone, Maya Carter, the FBI, anyone but himself. But the truth clawed at the edges of his mind. This was his fault. His temper, his arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. It had all led to this. The hours dragged on, marked only by the faint shuffle of officers in the hallway and the occasional muffled conversation. Bryce's thoughts spiraled further into chaos. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being the man in charge to sitting in this dingy cell, his career in tatters? The sound of approaching footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see a familiar figure standing outside the bars, Lieutenant Garrett Monroe, his superior, his protector, the man who had always had his back. Monroe's face was grim, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at Bryce with a mixture of disappointment and something Bryce couldn't quite place. Anger? Fear? Or maybe something darker? What the hell happened, Warren? Monroe's voice was low, but it carried the weight of authority. What did you do? Bryce opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain? How could he make Monroe understand how everything had spiraled out of control? I didn't, Bryce started, but the words felt hollow. I didn't know she was FBI. Monroe's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp. Didn't know what? That she was FBI? Or didn't know you were crossing the line again? Bryce flinched at the accusation, the truth in Monroe's words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. His stomach churned, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a vice. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Bryce muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe shook his head, his expression hardening. It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is what you did. And now, you're going to have to face the consequences. Bryce felt the last shreds of hope slipping away. Monroe was right. There was no getting out of this. No excuses, no explanations would change what had happened. I'm sorry, Bryce whispered, though the words felt meaningless even as he said them. Monroe stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Bryce alone in the suffocating silence of the cell. The sound of the cell block door closing echoed through the hallway, and Bryce sank back onto the cot, his head in his hands. Across the city, in a dimly lit FBI command room, Maya Carter sat at a table strewn with files, maps, and photographs. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the room. Maya leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing the tender bruise on her cheek. The physical pain from Bryce's punch was fading, but the emotional weight of the night lingered. Special Agent in Charge Daniel Harrington sat across from her, his sharp eyes scanning a report. You all right, Carter? He asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. I'm fine, Maya replied, though her voice carried a weariness she couldn't hide. Harrington studied her for a moment before nodding. That was a hell of a punch Warren threw. You handled it well. Maya shrugged. I had to. If I didn't, we wouldn't have gotten the evidence we needed. Harrington leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Warren's just the start. We've got a long way to go. Maya nodded, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about Bryce Warren. This was about dismantling a corrupt system that had thrived on fear and oppression. And she wasn't going to stop until the job was done. The room was thick with tension as Maya Carter sat across from her team in the dimly lit operations center. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows over the array of documents, maps, and photographs strewn across the table. Each item was a piece of a larger, darker puzzle, a system riddled with abuse and corruption. The team had been working for months, building their case piece by piece. Tonight had been a turning point. Special Agent in Charge Daniel Harrington stood at the head of the table, his stern gaze fixed on Maya. He held a file in his hand, the edges worn from constant handling. His voice, low but commanding, cut through the heavy silence. "You were right about Warren from the start," he said. "We knew there were problems in that department, but this is worse than we imagined." Maya exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the tender bruise on her cheek. The memory of Bryce Warren's punch was still fresh, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight of what she'd uncovered. Weeks of undercover work had led to this moment. Pretending to be a young woman struggling to adjust to a hostile neighborhood, she had witnessed firsthand the patterns of intimidation, violence, and systemic bias that officers like Warren thrived on. "He wasn't just another officer following orders," Maya said, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "Bryce Warren looked for opportunities to assert his power, especially over people who looked like me. He enjoyed it." Around the table, the team nodded grimly. Each agent had seen their share of injustices during the operation, but Warren had been a glaring example of the unchecked authority that had infected the precinct. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about an entire system that enabled and rewarded such behavior. "We've got him now," Harrington said, setting the file down with a sharp slap. "The footage from your body cam, the audio, the testimonies you've collected. It's more than enough to bury him. What he did tonight sealed his fate." Maya nodded, but didn't allow herself to feel triumphant. Warren was only one piece of the puzzle. "It's not just him," she said, her tone hardening. "The entire precinct has been complicit. They've covered for him, encouraged him, and turned a blind eye to what he's been doing for years. And then there's Monroe." The mention of Lieutenant Garrett Monroe brought a dark silence to the room. Monroe was smarter than Warren, more careful. But Maya had seen enough during her time undercover to know that he was the puppet master pulling the strings. Complaints disappeared, investigations were quietly dropped, and officers like Warren were protected under his watch. "Monroe's been enabling this for years," Maya continued, her frustration palpable. "He's buried every complaint against Warren, and I'd bet anything he's been taking kickbacks. We just haven't found the smoking gun yet." Harrington tapped his pen against the table, his expression thoughtful. "We need to be strategic," he said. "We can't go after Monroe until we're ready. If we move too early, we'll spook him and anyone else involved. But with Warren in custody, we've got leverage. He knows what's at stake. We flip him, and he'll give us Monroe." Maya wasn't so sure. She had seen men like Warren before, arrogant, entitled, and utterly convinced of their invincibility. Getting him to turn on Monroe wouldn't be easy. Still, the team had a solid foundation, and they weren't letting up now. Her gaze fell on the files spread across the table. Each one represented someone whose life had been shattered by the corruption in that precinct. Families torn apart, lives ruined, communities left in fear. It was more than a case. It was a reckoning. "We have to do this right," Maya said, her voice quieter but firm. "No slaps on the wrist, no backroom deals. We take them all down, and we make sure they can't come back." Harrington met her eyes, his expression resolute. "That's the plan," he said. "But it's going to take time. We'll push Warren, and when he realizes what's on the line, he'll talk." Maya wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded. The evidence they had against Warren was airtight, and for the first time, the scales were tipping in their favor. As the team continued to strategize, Maya's thoughts drifted back to the confrontation with Warren. She had known it would be tense, but the sheer violence of his reaction had shaken her. It wasn't just about the punch. It was the hatred in his eyes, the raw anger that erupted when he realized she wouldn't submit to his authority. She absently touched her bruised cheek, the sting a reminder of how deep the problem ran. Warren wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symptom of a larger disease, and Maya was determined to root it out. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their hum punctuating the silence of the cell block. Bryce Warren sat slumped on the edge of the cold metal cot, his head buried in his hands. The chill of the concrete walls seeped into his skin, a stark reminder of the reality he now faced. The rhythmic clang of distant footsteps echoed through the corridor, each step slicing through the suffocating quiet and sending a fresh jolt of unease through him. His mind replayed the events over and over again. The punch, the sickening crunch as his fist connected with her face, and the moment Margaret Hill revealed who she truly was. An FBI agent, an undercover operative sent to dismantle everything he thought he controlled. He had fallen right into her trap, and now he was here, trapped in a cell that felt smaller with every passing second. The door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Bryce's head snapped up, his breath catching in his throat. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, sharper, until they stopped directly outside his cell. He looked up to see her, Margaret Hill, standing with 2 federal agents at her side. Her face bore the evidence of his actions, a dark bruise swelling across her cheek, but her posture was unyielding. She stood tall, radiating an authority that Bryce couldn't ignore. Her expression was unreadable, her gaze piercing as if she could see straight through him. The agents flanking her unlocked the cell door with a metallic click, and the sound made Bryce flinch. Margaret stepped into the cell, slow and deliberate, her movements calculated. The agents stayed outside, their stoic presence a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. Bryce's heart hammered against his ribs as she crossed the threshold, closing the space between them. He tried to hold onto the remnants of his bravado, but it was slipping, crumbling under the weight of her gaze. For a moment, the air between them felt electric, thick with unspoken tension. Bryce swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his mind scrambling for words that wouldn't come. "You look like hell," Margaret said, her voice quiet but sharp, cutting through the oppressive silence. The bluntness of her words caught him off guard. There was no fury in her tone, no theatrical outburst, just calm precision. It unnerved him more than anger ever could. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Bryce stammered, his voice cracking. He hated how weak he sounded, how the confidence he once carried like armor had dissolved into desperation. Margaret tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" she asked, her voice edged with cold curiosity. "Didn't mean to punch me in the face? Didn't mean to abuse your badge? Or didn't mean to finally get caught?" Bryce's jaw tightened, but he had no response. The words lodged in his throat as the truth of her accusations struck like blows. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you?" Margaret continued, her tone steady but unrelenting. "Pushing people around, using your authority to make yourself feel bigger. You thought no one would notice, that no one could touch you." She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his. "Well, you were wrong." Bryce's pulse raced. He wanted to fight back, to deny it all, but he couldn't. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Her body cam footage, the testimonies, the years of complaints that had been buried by his precinct. He was trapped, and he knew it. Margaret straightened, taking a step back. "You don't scare me, Warren," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "You never did. Men like you think they're untouchable, but you're not. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the entire system that protected you." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. Bryce felt the walls of the cell closing in on him as the realization hit. This wasn't just the end of his career. It was the end of everything he had built his identity around. Margaret turned to leave, her presence as commanding as ever. As the cell door clanged shut behind her, Bryce sank back onto the cot, his mind a storm of fear and regret. Margaret's voice echoed in his ears. "Men like you always fall. It's just a matter of time." The cell's fluorescent light flickered, casting jittery shadows across the cold concrete walls. Bryce Warren sat stiffly on the edge of the metal cot, his shoulders hunched and his hands trembling faintly. His breath felt shallow, his pulse erratic as the sound of Margaret Hill's calm, measured steps echoed down the corridor. Every deliberate footfall was a reminder of his unraveling, a slow drumbeat marking the collapse of his world. She appeared before his cell flanked by 2 federal agents, her bruised cheek still swollen but her posture unwavering. The agents moved to unlock the door, the metallic click of the lock reverberating through the small space. Margaret stepped inside, her eyes locking onto Bryce's with an intensity that pinned him to the cot. Her gaze wasn't fiery or angry. It was cold, calculating, and utterly unrelenting. "Warren," she began, her voice low but razor-sharp, slicing through the silence. "You didn't mean to lose control, right? You didn't mean to hit me." Bryce's throat tightened, the words catching like shards in his throat. "I didn't know you were FBI," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I thought—" "You thought I was just another nobody," Margaret interrupted, her tone cutting. She took a step closer, her presence looming. "Just another person you could intimidate, shove around, and humiliate. Someone you assumed didn't matter." Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Bryce couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. She was right. He'd thought she was just another powerless person in his path, someone whose story no one would believe if it came down to it. He'd been wrong, terribly, catastrophically wrong. "Do you have any idea how many complaints have been filed against you?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising slightly. "How many people you've abused, how many lives you've ruined, and how many times you've walked away without consequence?" Bryce didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew the number, remembered each report as it was swept under the rug by the precinct. A slap on the wrist here, a verbal warning there. It was all he'd ever received. He'd always known the system would protect him. Until now. Margaret leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "You're not special, Warren. You're not different from every other corrupt officer who thinks the badge makes them invincible. You've been hiding behind it for years, but now there's nowhere left to hide." Bryce's anger bubbled beneath the surface. "I was doing my job," he snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "I was keeping the streets safe." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. "Safe for who?" she countered. "For people like you? People who think power is a weapon to be wielded against the vulnerable? You don't keep the streets safe, Warren. You terrorize them." The truth of her words burned, but Bryce had no defense. The carefully constructed facade of his career had been shattered, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. "This isn't just about you," Margaret continued, her voice rising. "You're part of a system that's been rotting for years. You think you're at the top of this? You're just a cog in a much larger machine, and that machine is coming apart." Bryce's stomach twisted. He had known the investigation was bigger than him, but the gravity of Margaret's words hit him like a blow. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I want names," Margaret said, crossing her arms. "Dates, details, everything you know about Lieutenant Hanlon and the others. You want to save yourself? Start talking." Bryce's pulse quickened at the mention of Hanlon. The man had shielded him, taught him how to survive in the murky waters of law enforcement. Turning on him felt like betrayal, but what choice did he have? "I can't," Bryce whispered, shaking his head. "I can't do that." Margaret's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice. You're done, Warren. The only question now is whether you go down alone, or if you help us take the rest of them down with you." Bryce sat frozen, the walls of his world closing in. Margaret turned, her voice echoing as she left. "Think fast, Warren. Time's running out." The sound of Margaret Hill's boots echoed in the dimly lit hallway as she left Bryce Warren's cell. Inside, Bryce sat slumped on the cot, the metallic clang of the door still ringing in his ears. Each second in that suffocating cell felt like an eternity. The weight of his choices bore down on him, suffocating any sense of resolve he'd once clung to. Outside, the firestorm of his arrest had already begun. Across the city, protests erupted. Crowds gathered in front of the precinct, holding signs that read, "End police brutality," and "Justice for all." Voices rose in unison, demanding accountability, not just for Bryce, but for the entire department. The streets buzzed with tension as helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the growing chaos. Chants filled the air, reverberating through neighborhoods long silenced by fear and oppression. For the people, Bryce wasn't just a cop. He was a symbol of everything they had endured. Years of systemic abuse, unchecked authority, and racial discrimination. Margaret stood in the FBI's makeshift office, watching the news unfold on a wall of televisions. Each headline was a testament to the magnitude of their investigation. Officer arrested for assaulting FBI agent, one ticker read. Another displayed a scathing headline, Rogue Cop Exposed, Department Corruption Under Federal Probe. The room buzzed with agents shuffling through documents, piecing together a larger picture of the corruption they were slowly unraveling. Daniel Harris, her supervisor, stepped beside her, his expression grim. "It's a powder keg out there," he said, motioning to the screens. "This isn't just about Warren anymore." Margaret nodded, her jaw tightening. "It never was," she replied. "The community's been waiting for this moment for years. They're not going to stop now." Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "And neither will Hanlon. We've got Steele in custody, but that precinct is a fortress built on fear and loyalty. You know he's watching every move we make." Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. "Hanlon's eyes on you. Stay sharp." A chill ran through her. She had expected retaliation, but knowing Hanlon's reach was unsettling. He was a man who thrived on control, and desperation would only make him more dangerous. Back at the precinct, Lieutenant Greg Hanlon stood behind his desk, staring out the window at the growing crowd. The chants of protesters filtered through the walls, a cacophony of anger that matched the chaos inside his mind. The blinds were drawn, but he could feel their eyes, reporters, activists, even his own officers, waiting for him to slip. His office phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He picked it up, his voice sharp. "Hanlon." The voice on the other end was thin, panicked. "Lieutenant, it's bad. The mayor's office is calling for a full internal review. They're bringing in civilian oversight, outside investigators." Hanlon's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles white. "And who do you think they'll target first?" he snapped. "You think they're going to dig through this department without dragging me down with it?" The voice hesitated. "If you don't get ahead of this, Greg, they will." Hanlon slammed the phone down, his mind racing. For years, he had been the architect of the department's inner workings, ensuring loyalty and silencing dissent. He had protected officers like Bryce, shielding them from complaints and investigations. But now, Bryce's recklessness had shattered that fragile system. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "You're part of a system that's rotting from the inside." The knock at his door jolted him from his thoughts. An officer stepped in, their face pale. "Lieutenant, they're here. Federal agents." Hanlon straightened, his jaw tightening. "Let them in," he said, masking the unease rising in his chest. Moments later, Margaret entered, her gaze sharp and unyielding. She didn't flinch, even as Hanlon's cold stare tried to bore into her. Behind her stood Harris and two agents, their presence radiating authority. "Lieutenant Hanlon," Margaret said, her voice calm but laced with iron, "we need to talk." Hanlon forced a smile, but the tension in the room was palpable. He could feel the walls closing in, the system he had built collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. But he wasn't done yet, not without a fight. As Margaret sat across from him, the air crackled with unspoken threats and mounting tension. The game was far from over, but for the first time, Hanlon felt the sting of power slipping from his grasp. The fluorescent lights of the holding area buzzed faintly, casting sharp shadows across the walls as Margaret Hill stood in front of Ryan Steele's cell. Inside, Steele sat slumped against the wall, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. The air was thick with tension, the kind that seeped into your chest and made every breath feel heavy. Margaret gripped the cold metal bars, her presence calm but commanding. "You don't look good, Steele," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "I wasn't sure you'd last the night." Steele didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted toward the floor. The bruises under his eyes told Margaret all she needed to know. Sleep hadn't come easily. She watched him for a moment, studying his posture, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his circumstances. Fear was etched into every line of his face. "You don't understand," Steele muttered, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Hanlon's not going to let me go. He's not going to let me talk." Margaret leaned in closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're right about one thing. Hanlon doesn't care about you. To him, you're just a pawn, expendable. And the second he thinks you're a liability, he'll get rid of you. But you have a choice, Ryan. You can let him control you, or you can save yourself. Steele's eyes flicked up to meet hers, a flicker of desperation breaking through the fear. You don't know what he's capable of, he said, his voice trembling. He'll kill me before I get the chance to say anything. And if he doesn't, someone else will. Margaret straightened, her expression hardening. You think staying silent is going to save you? Hanlon's already on borrowed time. The FBI is closing in. The public is demanding answers, and his empire is crumbling. You're in the middle of a sinking ship, and you're clinging to the guy who drilled the holes in the first place. Steele's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. Margaret could see the internal battle raging within him, fear and loyalty warring against self-preservation. I can't, he said finally, his voice cracking under the weight of his words. You don't get it. I owe him everything. He protected me, taught me everything I know. Without him, I wouldn't even be here. Margaret took a step closer, her voice soft but relentless. And where are you now, Ryan? Locked in a cell, facing federal charges, with no one to back you up. Hanlon isn't here to protect you anymore. He's protecting himself, and the second he thinks you're a threat, he'll bury you. Steele's breathing grew shallow, panic setting in as the truth of her words sank in. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his mind racing. Margaret pressed on, sensing the crack in his defenses. Ryan, listen to me, she said, her tone softer now but no less urgent. I can help you, but only if you help me. Hanlon has built his career on people like you, loyal, scared, and willing to look the other way. But you don't have to go down with him. You have a chance to take back control, to do the right thing. You can end this. Steele stared at her, his eyes filled with doubt and fear. For a moment, Margaret thought she had lost him, that he would retreat back into his silence. But then, something shifted. His shoulders slumped, and he exhaled a shaky breath. What happens if I talk? He asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret's expression softened, and she took a step back, giving him space. If you talk, we'll protect you. Witness protection, relocation, a fresh start. But you have to give me everything. Names, dates, every detail you can remember. You help me take Hanlon down, and I'll make sure you're safe. Steele hesitated, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He glanced at the bars, at the cold, unforgiving walls of his cell, and then back at Margaret. The fear in his eyes hadn't disappeared, but it was joined by something else, resolve. All right, he said finally, his voice steady but quiet. I'll talk, but you have to promise me. Hanlon can't get to me. Margaret nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. You're doing the right thing, Ryan. Trust me, this is the only way. As she turned to leave, Steele called after her. Hill, he said, his voice trembling again. You're sure this will work? Margaret paused, glancing back over her shoulder. We're going to take him down, she said firmly. But you need to trust me. And with that, she walked away, leaving Steele to grapple with the weight of what he had just agreed to do. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. The oppressive silence of the cell block was deafening as Margaret Hill knelt beside Ryan Steele's lifeless body, her breath catching in her throat. The cold of his skin confirmed what her heart had already feared. Steele was gone. Her fingers trembled as they rested against his neck, searching for a pulse that wasn't there. A knot tightened in her stomach, a heavy mix of dread, fury, and helplessness. This wasn't an accident. Margaret's mind raced, replaying every detail of the last 24 hours. Steele had been scared, trapped between fear of Lieutenant Hanlon and the chance of redemption she'd offered him. He was on the brink of flipping, of exposing the depths of corruption in the department. And now, just hours before his transfer to a federal facility, he was dead. It was too convenient, too calculated. Hanlon had made his move. She stood slowly, her hands still gripping the edge of the cot for balance, her eyes scanning the room for clues. Steele's body lay sprawled awkwardly, his face pale and drained of life. A thin, nearly invisible cord was looped loosely around his neck. Margaret's stomach churned. This wasn't suicide. It was a message. The shadows in the dimly lit cell seemed to stretch and twist, as though mocking her for being a step too late. Margaret took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She pulled a small flashlight from her belt and began scanning the room. The cell was bare, as expected, but a scuffed patch of concrete near the door caught her eye. Kneeling, she examined it closer. A partial footprint, larger than Steele's. Someone had been in here. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. Her pulse quickened. Hanlon hadn't even tried to hide his tracks. This wasn't just about silencing Steele. It was about sending a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the system. Margaret stood, gripping her flashlight tightly, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Steele had been right. The corruption wasn't just deep, it was suffocating. The sound of a distant door creaking open snapped her out of her thoughts. Instinctively, she drew her weapon, her body tense as her ears strained to pick up any sound. Footsteps echoed faintly, growing louder. Margaret backed out of the cell, her eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Her heart pounded as a figure emerged from the shadows, a uniformed officer she didn't recognize. "Agent Hill," the officer said, his voice cautious. His hands were raised slightly, palms out, as though to show he wasn't a threat. "I didn't expect anyone to be down here." Margaret didn't lower her gun. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Officer Klein," he said, swallowing nervously. "I'm on the night shift. I was just making my rounds." Her eyes narrowed. "Rounds? Then explain why the cell block is empty, why no one is monitoring this area, and why Ryan Steele is dead." Klein's face paled. "Dead? I didn't know." His voice faltered, and he glanced toward Steele's cell, visibly shaken. Margaret stepped closer, keeping her gun trained on him. "Who else was here tonight, Klein? Don't lie to me. If you're covering for someone, you'll go down with them." The officer hesitated, his eyes darting toward the exit. Margaret could see the fear in his face, the same fear she'd seen in Steele's eyes. Hanlon's grip extended far beyond what she had anticipated. "It was Hanlon," Klein whispered, his voice barely audible. "He came through here earlier. Said he needed to check on Steele. I didn't know this would happen." Margaret's jaw tightened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Where is he now?" "I don't know," Klein stammered, his hands trembling. "He left about an hour ago. Said he had business to take care of." Margaret holstered her weapon, her mind racing. Hanlon was running out of moves. Killing Steele was his attempt to buy time, to protect himself and the crumbling empire he'd built. But all it had done was confirm his guilt. "Klein," she said sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You report everything you've just told me to your superior. Right now. And if I find out you've withheld anything, I'll make sure you're the next one sitting in a cell." The officer nodded quickly, retreating down the hallway. Margaret turned back to Steele's cell, her fists clenched. She wouldn't let this end here. Hanlon thought he could silence the truth, but he'd underestimated her. Steele's death wasn't the end of the investigation. It was the spark that would burn Hanlon's entire operation to the ground. As she stepped out into the cold night air, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed Harris. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Steele's dead, and Hanlon's behind it." Harris's sharp intake of breath was audible. "We need to move now," he said. "Hanlon knows we're coming. He won't stop here." Margaret nodded to herself, determination hardening her resolve. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." The dim morning light cast long shadows over the FBI's temporary headquarters, but inside, the air buzzed with the energy of a team running on adrenaline and urgency. Margaret Hill stood in the center of the room, a photo of Ryan Steele pinned to the whiteboard behind her, his face now a stark reminder of how high the stakes had become. The team was laser-focused, their eyes glued to laptops and documents as they sifted through the evidence piling up against Lieutenant Greg Hanlon. Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She pulled it out to see another update from Harris. The enforcer linked to Hanlon's burner phone had been identified, a man named Eric Jansen, a known fixer who had ties to multiple incidents of silenced witnesses and suspicious deaths. Margaret's jaw tightened. They were closing in, but she knew the window to act was shrinking. Harris approached, his face lined with exhaustion but lit with determination. "We've got Jansen's location," he said, handing her a printout. "He's holed up in a warehouse near the docks. Local law enforcement is standing by, but this has to be quick. If he gets spooked, we lose him." Margaret nodded. "What about Hanlon?" "He's still at his precinct, but he's been on the phone non-stop. We've intercepted a few calls. He's scrambling, trying to secure his network. He knows we're closing in." Margaret felt a spark of grim satisfaction. Hanlon's desperation was a sign that the walls were closing in around him. But desperate men were dangerous, and she couldn't afford to underestimate him. "We need to move now," she said, grabbing her jacket. "If we can bring in Jansen, we'll have the leverage to crack Hanlon wide open." The warehouse loomed in front of them, its metal siding rusted and pockmarked, standing like a fortress against the breaking dawn. Margaret and Harris crouched behind a black SUV with a team of agents, their breath visible in the frigid air. The plan was simple: go in hard and fast, secure Jansen, and extract any evidence linking him to Hanlon and Steele's death. Margaret's heart raced as Harris gave the signal. The team moved in unison, boots crunching on gravel as they approached the warehouse. The lead agent held up a fist, signaling for silence, and Margaret could hear the faint murmur of voices inside. Jansen wasn't alone. The door was breached in a single, deafening motion, the battering ram sending it flying inward. Margaret was the second inside, her gun raised as she swept the room. Chaos erupted. Jansen was at the far end of the warehouse, flanked by two men with weapons. The enforcer's eyes widened in shock, but he recovered quickly, barking orders to his muscle. "FBI, drop your weapons," Margaret shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. One of the men opened fire, and the room exploded into a cacophony of gunfire and shouting. Margaret dove behind a stack of crates, her heart pounding as bullets ricocheted around her. She returned fire, her focus razor-sharp, her mind calculating every move. "Jansen's trying to run," an agent shouted, and Margaret's eyes snapped toward the back exit, where the enforcer was making a break for it. "Cover me," she yelled, breaking into a sprint. Her legs burned as she chased him through the maze of crates and machinery. Jansen was fast, but Margaret's determination was stronger. She closed the gap just as he reached the door, tackling him to the ground. They hit the concrete hard, and Jansen let out a pained grunt. "Get off me," he snarled, struggling against her grip. "Not a chance," Margaret spat, wrenching his arms behind his back and snapping cuffs onto his wrists. She pulled him to his feet, her adrenaline surging as she stared into his defiant eyes. "You're done, Jansen. It's over." The team secured the warehouse, and Margaret led Jansen outside, where Harris was waiting by the SUV. "Good work," he said, his expression serious. "Let's get him back to HQ. He's our key to Hanlon." As they drove away from the warehouse, Margaret sat across from Jansen, her gaze locked on him. "You're going to tell us everything," she said, her voice low and threatening. "Who gave the order to kill Steele? How deep does this go?" Jansen sneered but said nothing. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You think Hanlon's going to protect you? He's already cutting ties, cleaning house. You're expendable to him. But if you cooperate, you might just walk out of this alive." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Jansen's face. Margaret pressed on, her voice cold and unrelenting. "Talk, or go down with him. Your choice." As the city skyline loomed in the distance, Margaret knew the game had changed. Steele's death had lit a fire under the investigation, and now, with Jansen in custody, the pieces were finally falling into place. But she also knew the battle was far from over. Hanlon was still out there, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. Margaret's fingers sifted through the stack of papers with deliberate precision, her eyes scanning for anything that would expose the deeper layers of corruption Lieutenant Greg Hanlon had woven into the precinct. The office was eerily quiet now, the only sound the faint shuffle of documents and the distant murmur of officers realizing the gravity of what was happening. She stopped suddenly, pulling out a manila folder labeled "Special Cases." Her breath caught as she opened it, revealing a collection of complaints, all stamped with "dismissed," lack of evidence. Names she recognized from her time undercover leapt off the pages. Victims of police brutality, residents of the community who had been harassed, silenced, or worse. Each dismissal bore Hanlon's signature at the bottom, his authoritative scrawl a mockery of justice. "This is it," Margaret murmured to herself, her voice heavy with anger. This folder wasn't just evidence. It was a roadmap of Hanlon's manipulation, proof that he had systematically protected his officers at the expense of the community. The door opened behind her, and Harris stepped in, his expression grim but triumphant. "Hanlon's in the van," he said. He didn't say much, but the look on his face says he knows he's finished. Margaret nodded, holding up the folder. "This is bigger than I thought. These cases, they go back years, Harris. He's been covering for Steele and the others for over a decade." Harris glanced at the folder, his jaw tightening. "The tech team is already going through his computer. If there's a digital trail, we'll find it. But this," he gestured toward the folder, "this is personal." He didn't even bother hiding it. "Because he thought he was untouchable," Margaret said, her voice sharp. Steele was just the tip of the iceberg. Hanlon built a culture where corruption wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. Harris nodded. "And today, it all comes down." The precinct buzzed with a tense, uneasy energy as Margaret and Harris walked through the hallways, agents moving with purpose as they secured more evidence. Officers watched from their desks, their faces a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. Margaret caught snippets of whispered conversations. "Hanlon? They arrested Hanlon? This whole department is under fire now. What if they come for us next?" The last comment made Margaret pause. She turned to Harris, her voice low. "They're scared. They should be." "They should," Harris agreed. "But fear can make people dangerous. We need to keep an eye on everyone in this building." As they approached the exit, the cold morning air hit them like a wall. Outside, reporters and protesters had gathered in a chaotic sea of camera flashes and raised voices. The crowd surged forward as the FBI van carrying Hanlon emerged from the lot. Chants of "justice for all" and "end police corruption" echoing through the streets. Margaret stepped forward to address the media, her bruised cheek a stark reminder of the risks she had taken to get to this point. The cameras turned to her, and the shouting quieted slightly as she began to speak. "Today marks a critical step in the fight for justice," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "For too long, corruption has plagued this precinct, allowing officers like Ryan Steele and Greg Hanlon to operate without accountability. That ends today. The FBI is committed to dismantling this system of abuse and ensuring that those who have suffered at the hands of this corruption are finally heard." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound a wave of energy that seemed to push back against the years of silence and complicity. Margaret stepped back, her heart pounding as she rejoined Harris. "You handled that well," Harris said, his tone approving. "It's not over yet," Margaret replied, her eyes scanning the crowd. She knew Hanlon's arrest was just the beginning. There were others, officers, politicians, people in power who had enabled this system. And as long as they were still out there, the fight wasn't finished. Later that evening, Margaret sat in a quiet corner of the FBI office, the folder of dismissed cases spread out before her. Each name was a story, a life affected by the very system that was supposed to protect them. She felt the weight of those stories pressing down on her, but it only strengthened her resolve. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, and Harris stepped in, holding a USB drive. "We've got something," he said, handing it to her. Emails between Hanlon and city officials. Kickbacks, cover-ups, the works. It's enough to blow this wide open. Margaret took the drive, her grip firm. "Good. Let's make sure it does." As the night deepened, Margaret couldn't help but think about how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. Hanlon might be in custody, but the system he had built was still standing. Piece by piece, she would tear it down. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Margaret Hill sat in the dimly lit room, the small leather-bound notebook resting on the table in front of her like a loaded weapon. It was thick with years of secrets, names, dates, payouts, and crimes etched in black ink, the lifeblood of Lieutenant Greg Hanlon's corruption. Every page was a roadmap to the network he had built and protected, a system designed to keep the powerful untouchable while crushing anyone who dared challenge it. Margaret's fingers brushed the edge of the notebook as she exhaled deeply. This was more than evidence. It was a reckoning waiting to happen. Across the room, Harris leaned against the doorframe, his expression weary but resolute. "That notebook changes everything," he said. "This isn't just about Hanlon anymore. It's the whole damn department." Margaret nodded, her jaw tight. "We can't let this fester. Every name in here needs to be investigated, every connection pulled apart. If we stop now, it'll just rebuild itself." Harris crossed his arms, his voice quiet but firm. "Then we burn it all down." The next morning, the city awoke to a storm. Not from rain, but from the fallout of Hanlon's arrest and the revelations that were starting to seep into the public consciousness. News outlets replayed footage of the lieutenant being led out in cuffs, juxtaposed with the growing crowds outside the precinct. Protesters held signs high, their voices a crescendo of demands: end police corruption, justice for all. No more silence. Inside the FBI's temporary command center, the atmosphere was charged. Margaret stood at the head of a table surrounded by her team. The leather notebook was open, its damning contents splayed across the surface for all to see. "This isn't just Hanlon's playbook," Margaret began, her voice steady but intense. "This is a record of every officer who turned a blind eye, every official who took a payout, every innocent life that was crushed under their boot. And we're going to hold every single one of them accountable." The room buzzed with energy as agents began assigning tasks, combing through the information in the notebook to cross-reference with existing complaints and open investigations. Harris approached Margaret, his face lined with determination. "Hanlon's not talking," he said. "He's stonewalling us, hoping his silence buys him some kind of deal." Margaret smirked, the fire in her eyes unmistakable. "Let him hold his breath. The notebook speaks louder than he ever could." The tension outside the precinct was palpable as Margaret arrived later that day. The crowd had doubled in size, spilling into the streets. News vans lined the curbs, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, capturing every angle of the growing unrest. As Margaret stepped out of her car, a ripple of recognition spread through the protesters. A young woman holding a sign that read, "We see you, Agent Hill," caught Margaret's eye. The woman's expression was one of cautious hope, a reminder of why this fight mattered. Inside, the precinct felt like a different world. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their gazes darting nervously as Margaret and her team moved through the halls. The power dynamics had shifted, and everyone felt it. Margaret passed the office that had once belonged to Hanlon, now sealed off as evidence. The sight of it filled her with a grim satisfaction. At the end of the hallway, a conference room had been converted into a temporary war room. The walls were lined with photos, documents, and names. An intricate web of corruption slowly being unraveled. Margaret stared at the board, her eyes narrowing as she traced the lines connecting Hanlon to other high-ranking officials. "We need to move on these names fast," Harris said, stepping up beside her. "The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." Margaret nodded. "I want every one of them under the microscope. If there's even a shred of evidence, we bring them in." As night fell, the crowd outside swelled again. Margaret stood by the precinct's front steps, watching as people chanted for change. The weight of their voices filled the air, a tangible force that made her chest tighten. She spotted a young black man standing at the edge of the crowd, his fists clenched around a sign that read, "Justice for my brother." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Margaret felt the enormity of what they were fighting for. This wasn't just about taking down corrupt officers. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless, about healing a community that had been broken for far too long. Harris appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "You ready for this?" he asked. Margaret turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "We don't have a choice. This isn't just about them. It's about all of us. If we don't fight for this, no one will." Harris nodded, his resolve matching hers. "Then let's make sure they know we're not backing down." As the two of them re-entered the precinct, Margaret's thoughts lingered on the faces in the crowd. She had spent months infiltrating the darkness, risking everything to expose the truth. Now, standing at the cusp of real change, She felt a fire in her chest, a fire that burned for justice, for accountability, for a future where people like Hanlon and Steele could no longer hold power over others. This was just the beginning, and Margaret Hill was ready for whatever came next. The story highlights the critical need to confront systemic injustice, racism, and abuse of power with courage and persistence. It teaches that silence and complicity enable corruption to thrive, but accountability can spark meaningful change. In today's world, this means standing up against discrimination, demanding transparency, and holding those in power accountable for their actions. It reminds us that change often begins with individuals who refuse to accept injustice, even at personal risk. By fostering integrity, empathy, and collective action, we can dismantle systems of oppression and build a fairer society where every voice is heard and valued equally.
Subscribe Undercover Insights channel for more